Good evening, everyone. We're almost nearing the end of our 3 day literature festival, but the show is not over yet. Let me introduce you to our session today on love, poetry, and hope. For this very interesting session, we have with us Karuna Parikh, a poet and writer whose work has appeared in Vogue, The Wire, India Today, and Lonely Planet, amongst others. Her first novel, The Heart Asks Pleasure First, was published to great acclaim in 2020. Our second speaker is a professor of English and creative writing at Ashoka University, Saikat Majumdar. His most recent book is The Middle Finger, a campus novel that examines the intricacy of the teacher student relation through the lens of ancient myths. The third speaker for today is a user researcher who works on technology projects in emerging markets and the author of What Millennials Want, Vivan Marwaha. A millennial himself, he cares deeply about understanding India and its future through its youth. Last but not the least, the moderator for today's session is Milan Vohra. She has written 5 books and also a TEDx speaker and an advertising professional. We are so delighted to have you here with us. But before I hand over the session to Milan Vohra, I would request the audience to put their comments and questions in the comment section below. Over to you, Milan Vohra, to take the conversation forward.
Thank you, Sanchari, and thank you, AKLF, for inviting me to do this panel. Thank you, Oxford Bookstores. I just wanted to make sure I get that there because this is my first time here at this festival, and I am really privileged to be here. I thought this was such an interesting panel to put together, with the topic of love, poetry, hope, and then we have, Saikat and Karuna, 2 fiction writers, 3 if I include myself here in the discussion. And we have Vivan, who's written, a non-fiction. And then also the fact that Karuna has been writing poetry. And Saikat, you have a protagonist who's a poet. So this is going to call for a lot of interesting overlaps. And I think what makes it really interesting is that this non-fiction, that was thrown into this mix of the rest of us writing fiction is about what millennials want. And I'm gonna throw Vivan a little bit, off, by saying, the conversation that we were having just before, this panel, and I think you said something very interesting, which is, you said that I don't believe, there's romance that exists among young Indians. And, it came from the context of your findings with speaking with millennials. And the fact that, if you go away from what exists, say, is, represented in Bollywood or what's represented in the media, the rest of young India is living in socio-economic bubbles. So would you like to first just elaborate on that, and then we'll come to the authors? Because interestingly, I think both your protagonists, are millennials, which I thought kind of just made this thing very dynamic. So over to you, Vivan.
Milan, you've really started this discussion with the most controversial opening possible. But yeah, I absolutely stand by that. And I'm sure, I'm looking forward to Karuna and Saikat and everyone disagreeing with me. But as I write in my book, I interviewed more than 900 millennials. And I am a little bit of an outlier on this panel, given that my book is, a nonfiction, very research-driven book. And I don't deal with characters as much as I talk about trends and attitudes that are taking place in India. But one of the things that I found, no matter where I was, whether I'm in South Delhi, South Mumbai, or Bhopal, or Jabalpur, or Mysore, is that a majority of people my age, a majority of Indian millennials are having arranged marriages. And to just put an exact number on that majority, it's 84%. 84% of married millennials in India today have had arranged marriages. And when I spoke to some of these people, including people who were not married, and I asked them, would you have an arranged marriage or a love marriage? It was almost a heretical question I was asking, that obviously I'm going to have an arranged marriage, right? Like there's no other option that I have. And I was like, well, what's so obvious about that? And I started to dig a little bit deeper. And what I found was that for a lot of people, arranged marriages are sort of the only thing that is sort of available or possible to them, the only thing that they can think about. Because for a large number of young Indians who are living at home with their parents and who lack financial security, who lack economic stability, if their parents go and find a boy or a girl for them and they say, well, this is who you're going to marry, these people don't really have an option to say otherwise. And, when you're living at home with your parents and you say no, at the very least, that means a fractured relationship. And if you take that further, it could mean the loss of your home, and it could mean threats to your safety and security. And it could also mean death, like we see, murder, like we see so often in our newspapers. And so, as I write in my book, love marriages are something most millennials cannot afford in India today. Now, that's of course
I found very interesting that you talked about your when you talked about your research methodology and the sensitization, because nobody is going to come out and say I am anti. Whenever we're talking about intercaste marriages and so interreligious becomes even further daunting and so on. I thought it was very interesting the way you couched the question, and you talked about would you be okay if it's like saying my friend says she has this problem, versus saying I have this problem. So would you like to just quickly talk about that, and then we open it up to the rest?
Absolutely. So one of the questions that I ask, and survey questioners ask as well, is that would you be okay if someone else married outside of their community, so their caste group or their religion? And a lot of young Indians will say, yeah, it's fine if someone else does it. But then they are not actually doing it. So the thing is that, okay, if someone else is doing it, it's fine, but I am actually not doing this myself. And what I found is that, linked to the whole economic insecurity angle, these marriages and these arrangements take place within your communities, so within your caste groups. And so to break out of that itself is a very big taboo and is a very big step. And to break out of the religion, to break out of that community is even more unthinkable. And something I write in my book is I almost met no one who had an interreligious marriage while writing my book. Now, my goal is not to...
I'm going to put you on pause there for a minute and then take this to Karuna, because actually this question is to...
I was just about to... I was going to interject myself.
I was just going to say, Karuna, when we're talking about love and we're talking about, I think the most fundamental aspect to it is risk-taking. And the sense that I was getting when I was reading Vivan's book and what millennials want, I was getting a very deep sense of wanting to stay within the safety net, wanting to stay pragmatic, which meant that you are also not going to be taking risks that, that love involves. And in your book, the heart seeks pleasure. First, you have a situation with the Hindu Muslim. Sorry,
the heart asks pleasure.
The heart asks pleasure first. So in that, you've got this whole setup where there's a Hindu Muslim and that too a Pakistani Muslim relationship that's developing in Wales. So would you like to very quickly talk about that, and then also just put it in the context of, is this therefore all coming from the area of, wishful thinking, or, where do we see this going, if this is the reality and this is what we are doing as writers?
Vivan, I was going to interject here anyway, and I was going to say to you that I was, even, while I was listening to you speak, and clearly you're speaking from a very pragmatic point of view and research-driven point of view, but I think what you said disregards two things. One is that, that who's to say that love is only taking place in marriages? You might meet people who are saying, I would choose I will have an arranged marriage, or of course I'm going to have an arranged marriage, but what else is going on? And I think that's what I'm interested in as a writer of fiction and as someone who's written this, what some people find an unbelievable love story. What I'm interested in is forbidden love, and the love that doesn't go down as data, right? The love that the unspoken love perhaps that we're not talking about. And it's interesting because when I wrote my book, so many young people from across this country wrote to me and said, "This is my story. I wanted to get married to so and so, but I couldn't because of all these things that you mentioned, whether it's caste, whether it's religion, whether it's a class difference." And I got so many letters and so many messages from young people across the country saying, "This is my story, this is my love story." So I think there's also that aspect, and I don't know. I mean, because I have heard this from so many people, I don't think my book is one of wishful thinking. I don't think this story is one simply a fantasy or desire. I think it is very, very much a real story, and it is very much rooted in the stories from this country as well. So I think there's the spoken and the known, and then there's the unspoken, and we all know that so much love falls under that radar.
I think I'll just take this to Saikat now, because Saikat, again, in the conversations we were having just before this, you have a protagonist in Megha who is a creator. She is a poet, who seems to look at her work almost with some sort of detached kind of amazement or horror, different things, so coming from writing in this context, writing in the fact is that whatever you're writing, there are the politics of it, whether they are the actual the socio-cultural politics or the economics of it, or the aesthetics of it, all of it. What about the anxieties of the creator? You guys as the creators, or your protagonist, in this case Megha, who has this whole relationship, which is actually, I thought, was the bigger relationship in the book, her own, feelings towards her work and
Right.
how it changes after she moves back. So would you like to comment on that?
Sure. Thank you, and Ben, for this great question. And thank you, AKLF. It's always good to be back. I mean, I'm listening to both Karuna and Vivan, and they're kind of contradicting each other, but I'm actually finding myself agreeing to both of them. They're both right. And I think I'm really impressed with Vivan's research that millennials are more conservative. And as someone who's been teaching for several years, I agree with that. It doesn't surprise me. But at the same time, I think, it's about Karuna's point about the forbidden love story. What does culture represent? I think culture represents, especially when it comes to popular culture, and forgive me if I'm making the artificial distinction between popular and high culture, it often represents safe things because it has to. What is Bollywood show? Bollywood show can be very sort of radical on the surface, but internally we know they have to cater to certain mass values, and that might be changing with Netflix a little bit. I think literature, on the other hand, has often been daring. It is, if you have a novel like Nabokov's Lolita, that kind of what would be pedophilia, and yet that is kind of considered a literary classic. So I think as a writer, I have been very interested in, I think, what Karuna was hinting as, transgressive love stories, love stories which are not normative. I mean, in my novel, The Firebird, incest played a big role. There was incestuous relationship. And my last novel, The Scent of God, was a queer love story. It was a love story between, two boys in a Hindu monastic boarding school. So I find myself continually drawn to romance, which is very hard to endorse or approve in real life. And I think, when you're creating mass culture, it's always a risk kind of showing something that won't be accepted by the mainstream because people will not accept it. And I think what happens here is, when you're talking about teaching, that as an educator, since I teach and I talk about education, I believe in its power. And yet deep down somewhere, I also feel education is a kind of a repression. It sort of forces people to be part of this certain kind of hegemonic system. And I'm very much interested in the kind of power relationship and the kind of erotics that exist. Obviously, it's something that has come out in the global Me Too movement. The academic Me Too movement has really exposed. And I mean, in my book, as you know, has two epigraphs, one from Plato's Symposium, where Plato is ironically saying that, "Oh, Agathon, if you were to lie down next to me, how would knowledge travel from ignorance to excellence?" And then the other one is from Drona and Ekalavya, that, the relationship between Drona and Ekalavya. And for the longest time, I've been thinking, how do these stories play out in the campus today? What would a Dronacharya story, Drona Ekalavya story, look like a contemporary campus? what would Plato's play with the erotics between the teacher and the student? How would it play out, especially in a post-Me Too environment? So I think these are radically sort of linked with the question of learning. They're very much linked with the question, and because she's a poet, she's asking herself that who gets to write poetry? When I'm writing poetry about race, am I entitled, or am I speaking for somebody's experience? And I think she's very much, and Karuna will know about this, she's very much a performance poet. So her anxieties are kind of come alive when they're performed. So I think in many ways, the question of learning creativity, because I've found myself, I've done an MFA in fiction writing, that often learning to write has more to do with unlearning. It has to, more than learning, it's about unlearning. And especially when you're writing political poetry, it's also about unlearning your privileges. And so all these things are very, very urgent, because I feel, the things that are happening in contemporary campuses, nationwide and the globe, the kind of power relationships, the kind of, caste inequities, the kind of, all kinds of violations. And I felt, this story had to be told. It was kind of a demanding story, but it was a difficult story. But I think it comes out in many ways and ties back to the question of transgressive relationships, which I think literature has a kind of an obligation for. Which
let me just ask you a question here that I think maybe you'd like to address, or Karuna, before I come into the the mentoring part of it, and you touched upon education. But before that, I thought, what do you feel about cultural appropriation, Saikat and Karuna? Because Saikat, you have written a queer romance in your previous book. Here as well, you are hinting at attraction between, there is a same-sex attraction, at least let's building. I'm not going to give spoilers about anybody's books. I'd hate to do that. But let me just speak about that first with Karuna and come back to you, Saikat. Karuna, would you like to talk about that?
Yeah, sure. But before that, sorry, I just wanted to continue what we were actually speaking about for a second. I completely agree. And what you said at the end, that's what really resonates with me. And I sometimes wonder and think, I feel literature does have an obligation to that, right? To push the boundaries, to tell those stories. And this is also the burden of the writer of fiction, right? To tell the stories that are difficult, and to go on pushing those boundaries. But with that, I will say that, when I listen to, say, Vivan, when you were talking about your research, I think as a writer who's trying to be true to those ideals, right? Those ideals of poetry and of great literature, when I hear you speak about that research, I'm not discouraged or disheartened in telling those stories. I almost feel, and Saikat, maybe you will feel the same way, I almost feel a greater urge to tell them, because I feel like there's much more need and requirement to tell these stories, these, for example, love stories, or stories that exist beyond the boundary of what people feel is okay. And so I actually think this is where actual data like yours, Vivan, is so valuable, because it reminds us that we still have to fight that fight, and we still, poetry still has so much work to do in terms of freedoms, and in terms of pushing against, these false boundaries that have been created socially. So I do think there's also great value in knowing these facts, and knowing the figures, and knowing the data, because it spurs the dreamers amongst us on, right? I don't know if you'd agree with me, but yeah, that's kind of what I was taking from what both of you were saying.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I completely agree. I think this research is really useful. It's a reality check. And yet, I think, it's like, there's this wonderful essay by the American critic Lionel Trilling. He's saying that, in the 19th century, great novels took adultery as a subject, because everybody knew that European marriages were not about love and romance. They were kind of political alliances, business alliances. So romance could be sought, and Milan is the romance writer here. Romance had to be sought outside marriage. And then he's saying that in the 20th century, who cares about adultery? It's not a big deal. It's not even exciting. But then he says something really dangerous. He says that, look at a novel like Lolita. It is this 51-year-old man and a 12-year-old girl. And he goes on to say that is transgressive. Now, that is the subject of romance. It's an extremely dangerous thing to say. It's problematic on all kinds of gendered angle, racial angle. There's an older white man talking about it. But there's something in that. And I think, that's where Karuna says about poetry, that I think in many ways, poetry, the stakes are very different. When you're making a film with a big budget, I think you have to remember, is the public going to take it? Is it going to be one of those, big wedding, those thing that used to be made in the late 90s, But here, I think a poet has a lot of freedom, and a poet, because the financial stakes are not like that. And in my novel, it's a poet who is talking about race relationships. She lives in the US, and she's talking about the Black experience, but being as a brown person, I think this is where the question of cultural appropriation comes in, that can I talk about other kind of experiences? Can I? And when you're a brown person in the US, as I'm sure Vivan will know, that you are in a certain position, but when you return to India, suddenly you realize that you become white. And then there's a certain kind of unlearning that happens. Her poetry kind of dies out for a moment, that, I can't talk about power the way I did that in New York and New Jersey because I was the person of color there. But now suddenly, I'm privileged. So I think poetry and privilege, and I think, again, this is exactly,
I would love to take this discussion forward with you later, Saikat, because I kept wondering if her change of place, because when she was writing as the brown person in the US, as a brown person, it was almost as if, there is this pain, but there is also the pain of the black man, which is seen as a greater pain than of the brown man. Or you also have this constant juxtaposition of the white person doing the brown face, and so there is always that contrast. Whereas when she's back in India, as you said, she's almost as if she's become the white person, but she's also in a position of power. And I kept wondering if that is what gave her agency to push her relationship further, and I don't know whether it was intended or not, because, here she was not in that difficult sort of place of being, the marginalized kind of person.
Yeah, you realize you're in a bubble, and all of us who've lived abroad and have come back, we know how our positions differ, and once we come, and I think in her case, because the poetry was being performed, it had a certain viscerality, it had a certain body, when you kind of hear the poetry thrown to your face, and suddenly when you come back, you're like, oh, I'm so privileged. And then I think this is something I've thought a lot in the way domestic health enters into intimate spaces in our life. And I think how the Indian middle class and upper middle class deal with that question, that, how does it? And I think this is a problem that she faces, that the kind of intimate spaces that you negotiate with. And that's where I think the, kind of the Drona Ekalavya thing comes in, that what does someone like Drona do with a figure like Ekalavya? But privilege, I think, is very much at the heart of cultural appropriation. Who gets to write poetry? Who gets to write fiction? Who gets to write nonfiction? We all have a certain kind of agency. And how do we deal with that? How do we deal with that when we write? And in that sense, my novel is very self-referential. It is about the process of poetic creation. It is about the process of writing. It is about the question of race and how relationships enter. And also it's about a question of education. So I think these are unavoidable questions for all four of us who work over here.
Karuna, would you like to speak about that?
Can I jump in, actually?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
I just wanted to jump in for a second because on cultural appropriation and, ask you guys a question on actually cultural whitewashing. One of the things that I did while writing my book is I tried to watch, I'm not a big movie buff, but I tried to watch like movies from different regional language cinemas to kind of, the popular films and the films that were creating buzz to understand the different conversations taking place within the same country, but in different languages. One of the things that I found is that Bollywood completely whitewashes issues that regional language cinemas, confront head on. Now, I'll give you an example. Janhvi Kapoor's debut film, it was called Dhadak in 2017. And it's an adaptation of a Marathi film called Saikat, which is of an intercaste relationship. And in Saikat, this intercaste relationship is front and center. It's in your face, and that's what the movie is all about. Dhadak does not even mention caste. The caste has completely been taken out of the equation. Now, my question is, because we have, Saikat is, we have two people with links to Bengal, one who lives in Calcutta, and the Bengali film industry has always been traditionally so, pioneering in India. why do you guys think that there exists sort of these different islands of cinema in India, where one and even literature, where one set of writers are really interested in confronting some of these issues head on, but the dominant cultural industry in this country just does not even touch them?
That's a good question. I do not have the answers, but Saikat, maybe you want to. I also know I live in Calcutta, but I don't know enough about the Bengali, film industry because I just moved here. So yeah.
I think my situation is the opposite. I've lived away from Bengal for the last 22 years, but I was born there and I do speak Bengali. I have to say, I mean, this is a big discussion. I want to get caught in that, but I think the South Indian film industry is actually a lot more daring. And I think when I watch Malayali and Tamil films, I realized something, that they're drawn on this vibrant culture of performance, music, and especially music and dance. And I personally think this might be an unpopular thing to say, but I don't think Bengali film really compares with the film coming out of the South. Certainly not film now. We had independent figures who were mavericks, who were driven by Marxism, communism, certain philosophies. But I think on the whole, it's much more. But one thing you're right is that I think something happens when it gets to Bollywood. The stakes become, and I think this is, I've been to Mami, I've spoken to the film festival, and I think it's startling for us to realize when we talk to producers, the financial stakes are so amazing. We just write novels, poems, and our financial stakes are much lower. What we do, the kind of production value, but filmmakers are taking huge risks. And I think when you take huge risks, you just end up being conservative. So I think it's very hard. It's very daring when someone does it, but it's completely understandable.
But I think that it's also been a learning for a lot of people, even in mainstream Bollywood cinema, and going back a long time ago, even if it is a Pakiza, or it is, say, The Love for a Courtesan in Pakiza, or if it is in Bombay, which is an interreligious romance, you've still had the surprise that's come in there and been accepted and made it big. Which is almost like a representation of saying, like, there is a Lolita that survives, and that is a marker almost of the times. So I guess
I think
all draw hope in that.
Yeah, I think it is a great marker of the times that people aren't taking those risks, especially in Bollywood. And I do think that this brings up the question of censorship, doesn't it? And what is allowed and what is not allowed, and who is calling the shots and who is answering to who. And
but that's probably where Karuna, where OTT is helping push the boundaries much more. The fact that you could have a Chandigarh Kare Ashiki, which is a romance with
to be fair, even they, I mean, I have enough friends who work for those platforms, and they are very clear about just how much they can push and just how much they cannot, and what they can say and can't say. They live with the same fears as the Bollywood producers do about censorship.
Absolutely. I think we are
I thought, because we're talking about love, poetry, and hope, I'm just wondering, is hope something that we only keep within the covers, literally, in terms of the books we're writing, or is it particularly more, let's say, in poetry than in fiction? Karuna, you're writing both, and there is a lot of your poetry that comes into your book. Saikat, in yours, the protagonist is a poet, so there is, a sense of hope that crashes initially and then sort of, resurges with the character. I'm going to start with Karuna. Vivan, jump in anytime you want, to keep this a dialogue which is not just linked to our specific books, but the topics that we're here to discuss here. So Karuna, would you like to talk about hope first in the context of fiction versus poetry?
Honestly, I don't think I would be able to write poetry around the topic of hope, or write books with a sense of that without actually feeling it myself. I don't think that would be possible at all. That would be a false representation then. So I definitely live with hope for seeing freer times, seeing better times, seeing especially the next generation come up with greater ideals with a good amount of fight in them still. I find it interesting though, because my book, without giving away any spoilers, uh, I've I have received very, very varied responses to the ending of my book. And I'm always curious to see how people interpret it. And I wrote an ending that I thought was full of hope. But I often get responses saying, uh, why wasn't it more hopeful? And it always surprises me because that was not my intention at all. Um, and then I, of course, get people who see it the way I did. And so I do think that people are divided in this, and I can understand why, because I do think we're living in extremely troubled times. There's rarely ever any good news. And even disregarding the last 2 years, which have been so exceptionally hard around the world, I think, especially in this country, even before that, we've been seeing a terrible curtailing of our freedoms. I think we it's hard to keep that hope alive. But I definitely do. And maybe Vivan can actually give us a true sense of the data of hope over here and what young people in this country are thinking right now and what they
So
feel
there's a
about
poem
that.
that there was a poem that you had, which was talking about, give me the statistics of the number of men who raped. You know, so do you remember that poem? I thought that was
Yeah,
kind of
yeah,
like a very telling sort of a thing overall on data. What
yeah,
do we know? But
yeah.
Karuna, what I really found interesting is that you keep bringing up these themes of freedom and safety, and you keep juxtaposing it. And I found it a constant thread that was happening in your poetry as well as in the fiction.
And yes,
Right,
absolutely.
right.
Yeah, yeah.
So I think that again is really representative of the times that we are in, and we're writing about, because
Mm.
uh, if that is a primary sort of a driver for your characters and you as a poet,
Oh,
you know,
definitely.
yeah.
I think that so much of why I write is to keep that sense of hope alive within myself. Forget about for an audience. It's much more just for myself, and to make sense of events that are taking place around us. My writing is very much an unraveling of those feelings and then stitching it back together in something that looks brighter. Yeah.
Just to jump in there, based on what Karuna was just saying and what we were talking about earlier, one of the reasons why, I mean, the books that I'm often most attracted, the books I like the most, are those that actually don't reflect my real life, right? They're in many ways, they're fantasy novels, they're adventure books, and I like them because, I don't want to read about my daily life. I don't want to read about what I already know. And that's why I do think, contrary to what the data tell us, that's why I do think so many readers might, appreciate, Karuna's book, Saikat's book, which, full disclosure, I are on my list and are going to reach the top of my list after this session, but I have not had a chance to read yet, is because they don't reflect real life, and I think that's some of the greatest literature comes out of that genesis, that it parallels real life, and it's a commentary on real life to an extent, but it veers away from it, and it's fantasy. But because someone had mentioned data, and I just find this really interesting, I don't have data on books, but I do have data on movies, and a majority of young Indians today actually agree with the sentiment that if a movie hurts someone's sentiments, particularly your religious sentiments, it should be banned. And I have no reason to believe that people would not extend that to books. So let's say, Karuna becomes a real lightning rod of criticism tomorrow. I would not, I would not put it beyond a lot of people in our generation that they would support the banning of her book. Because, if it offends someone, people, millennials in India today would support the banning of that book. And, you've seen this in the past with Salman Rushdie, and that took place under, a Congress government in India. His book was banned. And in many ways, I do think that there are limits to creative freedom in India right now. and how far you can go, even if you're a writer, because, publishers at the end of the day will not, give you a platform.
But I think that, Vivan, I'm gonna jump in also here and say the very fact that, last year we saw two books that were getting into tricky areas, or let's say sort of sensitive areas. You had Burning, and then you had, The Far Field, both of which were, both appreciated a lot, but they were written by people writing outside of India. And the fact that we have Karuna and Saikat who are getting into areas which must be written about, and the fact that they're being published in India, that itself gives us a lot of hope, gives all of us as readers and writers, it gives you that sense of, okay, we're still there, we've still got a foot in, But I'm going to very quickly, bring this to Saikat about, the hope that even, when you talked about education and mentoring, because I see that we're running out of time faster than I realized. When you're talking about education and mentoring and that whole thing of, coming from the story of Eklavya and Dronacharya, and I thought it was, I don't know if it was intended, but I remember once a conversation I was having and saying that, the one thing you can't force is love. You can't force anybody to love you, And I thought it was very interesting. Similarly with mentoring, as much as you want, you may want to mentor somebody, as in your book, Megha wants to mentor Jishnu, who seemed to be the parallel with Arjun in this, Eklavya Dronacharya story, but it doesn't go the way she wants. Whereas she's actually been mentoring, I'm so sorry, I'm just forgetting, Poonam. She's been mentoring Poonam without even realizing it. So, and I think that's where your whole thing, the genesis of that middle finger and, the story evolved, right? So do you see that interconnectedness of mentoring and love? That's my questioning to you.
Yeah, actually that comes from another very controversial book. We've been talking of books being banned. Wendy Doniger's The Hindus tells this lovely story that there's a medieval Jain retelling of the Drona Ekalavya story where Drona is with Ekalavya and Arjun is the one who cheated and got his thumb cut off. And then Drona says that, you sneaky urban crook, Arjun, you deceived this, simple Bhil. And I'm going to give the boon that from now on, the Bhil warrior will be able to shoot with his middle finger. He can shoot without his thumb, which is where the book gets the title. So in a way, I think, of course, the unlikely mentoring, because obviously when Ekalavya tells Drona that you are my teacher, he's very surprised that when did I teach you? And he's like, yeah, I made this image and that was the present. So I think in a way, you're absolutely right that, it's very hard to say. Mentoring is a very personal process. It's a very personal process. And it fascinates me because it draws in both power and eros, because it's a very intimate process. And especially when it comes to mentoring of literature, arts, I think we're thinking of the Gurukula tradition of music. I find this very fascinating, even outside my novel, that idea of who gets to learn, sing in a certain way, who gets to dance in a certain way. What do you need? What do you need to make it as an actor? Who do you need to learn from? Whether one can make a science out of it. And we set up a creative writing program at Ashoka University. We have this whole, idea of creative writing. So I think these are fascinating, that how can these things be taught? And when you teach something like this, where is the question of power? And I think this very much applies, Milan. I know you've written quite a bit about media and the advertising industry. And I'm sure it's equally true there that, there are mentorships, there are interns. I think you cannot move in any walk of life without finding mentors. But I think this really mentorship relationship is such a loaded thing. There's so much power, there's so much intimacy, and where does it go? And I think
and the boundaries, right.
So I mean, obviously the Me Too.
So we have some questions, Saikat. I'm getting reminders that we are very short on time. I'm so sorry to to rush through this. I'm just going to look. One is asking, in this era of digitalization where everything is represented with a beauty coat over it, let's say gloss, how would we shut out toxic thoughts about love emerging from social media? Okay, so the person is already, I think we've addressed that already. We can move on. Then the next is, speaking of stories that need to be told, do you think we have enough queer representation in today's literature? Who'd like to address that? Do we have enough queer representation?
My short answer to that is no, we don't. But if anyone wants to go longer,
Yes.
I think that's definitely very tricky. But I think, in a way, after the decriminalization of homosexuality in 2018, I think the perception of queer literature has also changed radically, because there was this whole sense that literature and arts must form this liberal. And I think in arts are not manifestos. It's true that they celebrate things, and I think there's been queerness in literature for the longest time. Obviously, going back to Chughtai's Lihaf, or even further back, myths and all that. But it's not like literature doesn't follow legislation. So I think, some criticism of my novel, The Scent of God, was that it was not activist enough. And I think one has to remember that when he's writing poetry or fiction, it is not an activism manifesto. But yes, and legislation creates expectations which arts can't always address, even though they are in conversation with that. But the short answer, I completely agree, there isn't enough, simply because it's a transgressive form of relationship. It's hard to accept that.
Right. And there's another question that's come up. How much have you evolved as a person out of your books? Have your books changed you, in short? Vivan?
Again, I'm the outlier. My book has definitely changed me. It's very different from saying you're a writer to an author of a book that's out there in the public domain. And the reason I wrote my book was to start a conversation about the needs and wants of Indian millennials. And I've been far more involved in the solution bit of that project now that my book is out. I'm working on more tech projects, on more solutions that solve some of the problems I'd identified. So absolutely, but from a fiction point of view, I'm sure Karuna or Saikat would be better able to respond to that.
Okay, Karuna, your turn.
Well, my book changed my life, that's for sure.
As a person, I think the same.
But just as a writer, and I'm sure all of us have been through this. The process of writing a book and putting it together, you're never going to be the same person after that, right? Mm-hmm. But specifically to what I wrote, I think it made me much more aware. At least my first book, which is the novel that we've been discussing, it made me so much more aware of these stories around me, and I became very, very sort of aligned to these stories. And I couldn't help, I could no longer ignore them when I heard them. When I heard stories about interracial love, intercaste stories, they speak to me in a completely different way now. They feel far more personal, because I feel like I have lived that story through writing it. So perhaps earlier they were news items, but now they feel like an extension of my world. And I think it's become far more personal for me.
Karuna, can I ask you about poetry? Because that's my biggest. You're talking about fiction, but I'm really curious. I'd love to know what you feel about poetry, and partly because this is my act of cultural appropriation. I've written about a poet and a woman poet too. I don't write poetry at all. I dare to write. So I'm really nervous about this. But because what do you think? Poetry, I feel, has a more visceral quality, because fiction is packaged. It can read over time. It's kind of, especially when it's poetry that is performed, right? And this is something I think a lot about, how poetry changed from performance to print. And this is something I talk about too. So how do you feel when your poetry gets body in shape? Or for instance, poetry in social media, when you kind of have a direct exchange right away. So do you feel then the impact is different than from writing a book, which takes a longer time? And
that's a great question. I actually, in the months building up to my poetry book's release, I found that I actually stopped putting out work on social media. And I don't know why. Perhaps I was just distracted. But I think I started understanding that they were different things and that I would feel them very differently. And I think that, social media, of course, has the question of instant gratification, right? But I found that because it's such a specifically weird audience on social media, and people tend to be so strange and strangely aggressive at times on social media as well. I think now when I look back, I realize I stopped putting it out in order to be able to make the poetry I was putting into my book far more honest. And, it because I think to write poetry that feels real, we have to strip away all pretense, right? Because it's so obvious when it's not straight from the heart. One can really sense it, I think.
In fact, I was just
So
going to say that, I thought that, we can, I've had actors speak about, emotional appropriation. You can assume at least a pain of one, or one sort of experience and say, I can use this, to perform another scene, or as a writer of fiction also, you can say loss. I can, look at one kind of loss and write about that. But I feel that I don't know if that works in poetry at all.
yeah, I don't think so. I think you have to have a very all-rounded empathy, and you have to really raise your levels of empathy while writing poetry and completely dash all your fears. Your fear has no space over there, I think, when you're writing it. I don't know if you feel the same way, but that was my experience of putting together a book of poems. And I just want to go back to one thing you said, about the cultural appropriation. I do find that one of the problems also in this millennial existence is we call everything cultural appropriation. And I think that is very much the enemy of art. And maybe I'm speaking as a person of great privilege, but I do think that we need to start questioning, whether art should have these boundaries drawn around it. And you spoke a lot about Lolita, and of course, as a young woman reading Lolita, it was very disturbing for me to read. But would I not want that piece of art to exist at all? I don't think I would go that far. And the same way, I don't think writers, for example, should be forced to write from their own gender. I don't think that. I mean, we would not have some of the greatest novels and books of our time, right? If we drew those lines. So I also, coming back to what you were saying about cultural appropriation earlier, and Milan, you as well. I don't agree with this constant calling of cultural appropriation, and I think it's the other side of cancel culture, right? And I don't agree with that. So yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I have a lot of nervousness about this because, I've written about women characters, but the first time making a woman protagonist and a poet, I mean, probably someone very much like you. And I'm like, I mean, is it possible? I don't write poetry myself, and I dare to write a few poems for this book, and I'm very nervous. And then this whole question of performance, race, in fact, the protagonist is worrying about cultural appropriation herself. But I think it's very, very risky. One can help, one cannot help. And I think the problem is when you are a white person writing about a black person, then the questions come. But as a black person writing as a white person, it's about, as a woman, if you're writing as a man, it is seen as less because I think our relationships are there. That's when the stakes seem to be different. But I think
of course, and of course it's risky, but I think there are ways and ways to do it, right? And again,
shall we, Karuna? I think we're going to have to end it on that note of finding the ways to do it, and not put ourselves in boxes, etc. But we're out of time, and I think I'd like to leave it on that hopeful note and say that let's not do this. Let's not be putting boundaries on ourselves, and obviously do a lot more research and understanding and so on before we're writing any character. That's about it. Absolutely. Thank you so much, guys. I've had a great time talking to you all. Thank you for being here.
Thank you.
I hope your next book reflects that the fiction that's coming out of this period actually did drive some change for us, Vivan.
Thank you. I hope so too.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Hope is stubborn. Yeah. Thank you all.
Bye-bye.